Okay, let's unpack this. We are embarking on a deep dive into, well, a really infamous moment of ancient history. A moment so dark, it fundamentally challenged everything the Athenians believed about their own democracy.
Uh-huh. Infamous is definitely the word for it.
Our focus today is the mass trial and execution of the 8 victorious generals following the decisive naval battle of Arginusae in 406 BCE.
Yeah, this is one of the most, I'd say, chilling case studies of legal failure in the entire ancient world. It really is.
How so?
Well, you have a society, Athens, right? A place that basically defined itself by its innovative democratic institutions, its commitment to the rule of law.
The very model people point to.
Exactly. And then suddenly, dramatically, it turns those very mechanisms against itself. It's quite shocking when you dig into it.
Right. So our mission today is really to explore how this happened. How could this legal state, which had built up these, sophisticated structures, meant to ensure fairness?
Supposedly ensure fairness, yes.
How could it just throw all of that out? In a moment of extreme public grief, political frenzy, these generals had just delivered a huge, desperately needed victory against the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War.
A massive victory, yeah. And yet they were condemned to death. And crucially, not for losing the battle.
No, that's the thing.
Right.
Not for losing, but for failing to rescue their own drowning survivors and retrieve the bodies after this massive sudden storm just hit the battle site.
And that right there, that's the ultimate tension in any state based on popular sovereignty, isn't it? We're looking at the exact point where political passion, the immediate rage of the demos, the people,
So swept everything else aside.
swept aside centuries of legal evolution, and the single most important element of this whole miscarriage, the thing we have to focus on, was violating that fundamental right to an individual trial.
Ah, right, that's key.
It's a right established specifically to ensure that justice, actual justice, not just collective hysteria, was served. Condemning 8 men together like that, it changed history.
So we're going to trace this breakdown of protections. The profound risk that came with just being an Athenian military leader, and also the extraordinary story of the one man who stood against the tide. Socrates.
His role is absolutely pivotal.
Okay, let's start by setting the scene for everyone listening. Being an Athenian general, a strategos, it wasn't just a military job, was it? It was maybe the most high-stakes political office you could hold.
Oh, absolutely. Perilous is the right word. You have to understand that command in Athens was inherently deeply political. These weren't career officers like we think of today.
No.
They were high-ranking citizens,
Yeah.
often wealthy, elected every year. Like, think about it, figures like the great statesman Pericles or even the famous tragic poet Sophocles, they served as general.
Sophocles the playwright.
Really?
Yeah.
Yes, Sophocles himself. It shows you how intertwined military command and political life were. And it meant that any military failure or perceived failure immediately translated into political vulnerability back home.
And the risk profile for these generals,
Mhm.
it sounds like it was just off the charts. Mostly because of this constant, intense accountability.
Intense is right.
It wasn't just that they might face prosecution if they lost the battle, which happened often enough, I gather.
Oh, yes. Very common.
But they could face prosecution if, I don't know, the campaign wasn't seen as successful enough, if the political winds shifted back in Athens, or, and this seems critical, if their own troops, the citizens they commanded, were unhappy with them.
That accountability pressure was massively amplified by the financial expectations placed on the elite. We absolutely have to talk about the liturgies.
Right, the liturgies. Compulsory financial services, basically.
Compulsory, yes, and often ruinously expensive, especially the most dangerous one for a commander. The triarchy.
Okay, break that down for us. What did the triarchy actually involve? It wasn't just writing a check for a ship, was it?
Oh, far from it. It was this open-ended, dangerous, and potentially bankrupting obligation. If you were assigned a triarchy, you were expected to fund, outfit, and often command a trireme warship for a whole year.
Wow.
You paid for the maintenance, sometimes even the crew's wages if state funds were short, and you were personally responsible for making sure that ship was ready for battle. We're talking massive personal financial liability.
So if your ship was damaged or lost in battle?
You could lose a substantial chunk of your personal fortune. Gone. It compounded the military danger, risking your life, with the very real risk of financial ruin.
So if you were a wealthy Athenian, you weren't just risking your neck out at sea, you were risking your entire family's economic stability. And the astonishing thing is this burden didn't just stop when you got old.
That's right. Unlike serving as a hoplite, a heavy infantryman, where men were generally exempt after age 60, there seems to have been no strict upper age limit for being liable for the triarchy. It meant that wealthy commanders were perpetually at risk their whole lives of both financial ruin and legal trouble tied to their service.
Mhm.
The stakes weren't just high, they were like existential for their family's position in society.
So imagine being a general. You know that losing your ship could mean ruin, and you know that losing the favor of your troops could mean prosecution back in Athens. That must have created this profound tension, right, between doing what's militarily necessary, like strict discipline, and just doing what's politically expedient to survive.
Absolutely. It's written all over the sources, implicitly and explicitly. Things like desertion or minor misconduct among the hoplites, and crucially, the rowers. These were common.
The rowers being the poorer citizens, the thetes who formed the bulk of the naval crews.
Exactly. The very same citizens who would later sit on the juries, the dikasteria, judging these generals back in Athens. And this is where a general's calculation, his self-interest, often seemed to override strict military procedure.
So tell us more about that, this idea of it being prudent to just look the other way sometimes. Why was avoiding a disciplinary issue seen as the safer bet for the general?
It comes down to the political dynamics back home. Imagine a general harshly disciplines a rower for, say, petty theft or being briefly AWOL. That rower, maybe feeling unfairly treated, is now a citizen with a vote and a voice. He goes back to Athens, highly motivated to join any formal prosecution against that general. Maybe he exaggerates the general's other supposed failings. It's easy to do in that environment.
Whereas if the general just ignored the minor offense.
That rower might stay relatively content, do his job, and later be much less likely to join some political movement trying to bring that general down. It's a kind of quid pro quo, almost. Keep the troops happy, they might keep you safe politically.
It sounds like a really vicious cycle, though. The commander has to maintain his political safety by being lenient, maybe overly lenient, but that very leniency could easily erode military effectiveness and discipline.
Precisely. It just hammers home the point that the authority of the strategos, the general, was never absolute. It was always conditional. Conditional on the favor of the political body back in Athens, and crucially, that included the armed citizenry itself serving under him.
And this conditional authority, this power of the troops, it wasn't just theoretical, right? It was demonstrated very vividly by the fleet itself, which was the real source of Athenian power.
Oh, absolutely. We have some really striking examples of the immediate non-judicial power wielded by the armed citizenry, the demos, in uniform, you could say.
Like what happened with the sailors at Samos. That sounds dramatic.
Extremely dramatic during a really turbulent political period around 411 BCE, with oligarchic plots swirling back in Athens.
Okay.
The sources, particularly Thucydides, tell us that the sailors of the main Athenian fleet based at Samos basically acted as the true representatives of the Athenian people. They took matters into their own hands. They literally deposed the oligarchic generals who they distrusted, generals appointed from Athens, and elected new ones right there on the spot, commanders they felt were loyal to the democracy.
Wow. Just elected new generals themselves.
Yes. And even more astonishingly, they unilaterally voted to recall and pardon the controversial figure Alcibiades, a man who had been disgraced, condemned, and exiled by the official assembly back in Athens.
That is staggering. So the fleet itself, the sort of physical embodiment of Athenian power, could just overturn decisions made by the magistrates in the assembly in Athens by electing new leaders right there.
It shows you where the real power could lie in moments of crisis. It's immediate, it's non-constitutional in a way, and terrifyingly volatile.
The will of the armed demos.
Nothing really stood in its way when it was unified and determined. And we see other examples, too, where military authority was gained more through, let's say, popular will and circumstance than strict legal appointment.
Like Demosthenes at Pylos.
Exactly. During the Pylos campaign in 425 BCE, initially, Demosthenes didn't have official command in that specific area, but a chance storm forced the fleet to take shelter at Pylos, this naturally strong location on the Peloponnesian coast.
Okay.
Demosthenes just seized the moment. He didn't have the formal authority, but he persuaded the existing commanders, and crucially the troops themselves, that they absolutely had to fortify this place immediately.
And they listened.
They listened. He basically initiated a major pivotal military episode, the capture of Spartan soldiers, a huge morale boost for Athens based on his persuasiveness, the obvious strategic advantage, and the consensus of the moment. He kind of bypassed strict protocol because the opportunity was too good to miss, and the troops backed him.
These examples really paint a picture, don't they? A military system operating constantly on political calculation, personal influence, popular will. Not just on law and hierarchy.
It was baked into the system.
So when the assembly back in Athens received the horrific news from Arginusae, yes, the great victory, but also the thousands of Athenian citizens, their bodies lost to the sea, unrecovered.
And buried, which was a deep religious and cultural offense.
Right. They weren't necessarily thinking about careful individual legal proceedings based on evidence, were they?
Not at all. They were primed, absolutely primed, to react based on immediate, collective, overwhelming grief and, frankly, inflamed rage. And they needed visible targets, the generals.
And this brings us right to the core legal principles that the Athenians just shredded in the heat of the moment after Arginusae. What was the most fundamental concept of justice that the assembly violated when they condemned all 8 generals together in one go?
They completely violated the foundational principle of individual liability. This was a cornerstone, arguably the cornerstone, that defined Athenian justice as having moved beyond more primitive forms.
Okay.
And to understand just how radical, how backwards this violation was, we really have to look back centuries earlier to Draco's foundational homicide law, probably around 621 BCE.
Draco. Usually associated with harsh laws, right? Draconian.
Yes, though that reputation might be partly exaggerated. But his homicide law was revolutionary for its time. Before Draco, what was the standard for dealing with, say, a killing?
What was it?
The standard was essentially vicarious liability, collective responsibility. In early Athens, if someone committed a serious crime, like homicide, the entire kin group, the genos, the extended family or clan, could be held responsible.
The whole family.
The whole family. Think about the historical curse on the Alcmeonids. An entire aristocratic family group was held responsible, cursed, exiled, their ancestors' bones dug up, all because of actions taken by some individuals generations earlier. Justice was a collective debt, a collective stain, and often led to ongoing blood feuds between families.
Okay, so a much more archaic system.
Very much so. Draco's reform was revolutionary precisely because it rejected this idea of collective guilt. He pushed Athens towards individual accountability.
So he focused the legal spotlight just on the person who actually did the deed.
Precisely. Draco's law insisted on a direct individual standard of liability. A killer was judged, not his whole family. And specifically, only if they killed with one's own hand, the autokere, or if they conspired to kill, hobalisa.
So the actual killer or the person who planned it?
Yes. Those two individuals incurred equal liability under the law, and critically, only those individuals incurred liability. This was a massive step towards what we think of as modern legal thought. Accountability based on personal action or proven intent, not just your family name or your office.
Okay, so connecting that back to Arginusae, the moment the assembly voted to condemn all 8 generals in a single motion.
They completely ignored that principle. They didn't care about individual actions, which generals were maybe genuinely hampered by the storm, who might have tried to organize a rescue, who made which specific decision under pressure. They just substituted collective military responsibility. They were all generals, therefore they were all guilty for individual legal fault.
Like they just rewound Athenian law hundreds of years.
In effect, yes. They dragged Athenian jurisprudence right back towards the age of collective responsibility and blood feuds. It was a shocking return to vicarious liability, but this time applied to the office of general, the strategoi, rather than the genos.
They were condemned for the collective failure of the command group to save the men.
Exactly. Disregarding centuries of legal development that said each man deserved an individual defense, an individual judgment based on his own personal role and culpability, or lack thereof.
And this total collapse of legal principle, it was made easier, wasn't it, by the very structure of the Athenian court system itself.
Oh, absolutely. The system itself was vulnerable to this kind of passionate overflow. Athenian litigation, as we've touched on before, relied entirely on private initiative. There was no state prosecutor.
Right, self-help, basically. You had to bring the case yourself.
You had to bring the case, gather the evidence, make the speeches, and who decided the case? Not professional, trained judges, but the dicasteria.
These huge juries of ordinary citizens.
Huge juries, sometimes hundreds, even thousands of citizens chosen by lot. And this wasn't a court focused purely on abstract points of law. It was really an arena for social and political performance.
Performance.
Yes. The rhetoric used by litigants, the speeches they gave, had to appeal directly to the jurors' shared values, their emotions, their fears, their grief, their anger, their deeply held moral convictions about honor and duty.
So winning a case wasn't just about the facts of the law, it was about winning over the crowd emotionally.
To a huge extent, yes. Litigation often became a form of public feud, or what scholars call an agon, a contest, a struggle for status and reputation in front of the community. Arguments focused intensely on assessing the character of the people involved, their social standing, their reputation, their perceived moral fiber.
Yeah.
Often more so than on strictly interpreting a statute or citing legal precedent. The goal frequently was to destroy your opponent's reputation in the eyes of the jury to win your case.
So the passions that could be appealed to.
Were often the most basic, the most visceral. Enmity, revenge, envy, and honor, as one scholar puts it. These were powerful tools in the hands of a skilled speaker.
Okay, I can see it now. When that massive wave of public grief and anger over the lost sailors hit Athens.
It was almost inevitable that it would be channeled into this kind of judicial feud, and the generals were the obvious, visible, high-status targets. Easy scapegoats.
And crucially, the sources tell us, don't they, that one of the men involved, the demagogue Theramenes, played a key role in whipping up this frenzy.
Theramenes' role is absolutely critical and deeply cynical. He was actually one of the subordinate commanders, a triarch, who had been tasked by the generals with carrying out the rescue mission.
So he was involved in the failure.
He was directly involved, yes. But the storm hit, preventing the rescue. When the backlash began in Athens, Theramenes, seeing the political danger to himself, skillfully shifted the blame entirely onto the main generals. He presented himself as the one who would have saved the men, but was prevented by the generals' incompetence or neglect, fueling the public outrage against them.
He needed a scapegoat to save his own skin.
Precisely. He turned on his fellow commanders and mobilized that public grief for his own political survival. And this is where the concept of hubris becomes a really potent rhetorical weapon used against the generals.
Hubris, we usually think of it as excessive pride, right?
In a general sense, yes. But legally, in Athens, hubris had a more specific meaning. It referred to egregious misconduct, particularly acts like physical assault or treating a free citizen like a slave, basically. A profound insult to a citizen's dignity and status.
Okay, a serious charge.
Very serious. But rhetorically, in the political arena and the courts, the term could be stretched. Prosecutors or demagogues like Theramenes used it much more broadly. They characterized the general's actions, or in this case, their failure to act in rescuing the men, as outrageous negligence, as arrogance, as a fundamental disrespect towards the drowning citizens and their unrecovered bodies.
So they weren't just incompetent, they were insultingly arrogant.
Exactly. By framing the failure to rescue as an act of hubris, as if the generals were so high and mighty they actively disregarded the lives and the proper burial of the common demos, the demagogues managed to magnify the perceived crime. It wasn't just incompetence caused by a storm, it was painted as moral wickedness, a deliberate slight.
It effectively turned a natural disaster, a storm, into a crime of moral failure, deserving the absolute harshest punishment.
Yes. The collective rage, fueled by grief, was transformed into an issue of wounded honor and the need for revenge. And that kind of emotion was easily mobilized against the men in charge, the men who dared to survive while so many others perished.
This whole tragic outcome really forces us to look hard at maybe the structural fragility of Athenian democracy itself. It was a system, wasn't it, where the sovereignty of the laws was never fully separate from the interests or the passions of the demos, the common people.
That lack of clear separation, that's the central dilemma here, I think. While Athenian ideology proclaimed that the laws were equal and similar for all, the ultimate final sovereign power rested with the mass assembly.
The people themselves.
The people themselves gathered together, and if the popular will, driven by intense political passion or fear or grief, decided to disregard established legal procedure, well, there was no independent constitutional check, no Supreme Court, no higher authority that could step in and say, hold on, this is illegal, you can't do this.
The assembly's decision was final.
Essentially, yes, their vote was the highest law in that moment.
And we know this environment, this system, was prone to political manipulation. The trial of the generals wasn't just some bizarre, isolated accident, was it? It feels more like the ultimate terrible product of a political system that was always vulnerable to demagogues playing on emotions.
I think that's fair to say. We see the historical precedent for this kind of manipulation and the potential for constitutional crisis playing out shortly after this trial during the brief but brutal regime of the 30 tyrants.
The oligarchs who took over after Athens lost the war.
Exactly. Now, even though the 30 were oligarchs, not Democrats, the way they abused power mirrors, in some ways, the failures of the Democratic Assembly during the general's trial. The sources tell us the 30 deliberately annulled established laws, like Solon's. They spread false information. They actively worked to drive citizens apart through fear and partisan rage.
So whether it's an oligarchy or an enraged democracy.
The institutions themselves could be corrupted. They could be turned into instruments of oppression and constitutional crisis when driven by unchecked power and partisan fury. It's a rather terrifying realization about the fragility of any political system.
It really sounds like that ancient philosophical warning, doesn't it? The idea that if you give too great a power to anything, everything is overthrown.
That's the one. The quote continues, warning that power, in the wantonness of excess, runs to injustice, which is the child of excess. It's often attributed to Plato, discussing the dangers of imbalance.
And that perfectly describes the assembly's actions after Arginusae, doesn't it? The assembly, the body with the ultimate authority, driven by this excess of collective grief, whipped into a frenzy by demagogues like Theramenes. It became the very agent of injustice born from that excess.
Precisely. In that moment, the assembly stopped acting like a deliberative body weighing evidence and law. It became, purely and simply, a vehicle for immediate, destructive political will. The failure was one of institutional self-control, you could say.
It couldn't resist the urge for immediate revenge.
It couldn't or wouldn't. It sacrificed 8 men, victorious commanders no less, largely to satisfy the public demand for a scapegoat for what was fundamentally a natural disaster compounded by the chaos of war.
And the irony here is just profound, isn't it? Especially when you think about Athenian cultural pride and their legal system, their most famous tragedies, like Aeschylus's Oresteia.
Which is foundational for Western drama.
Right. It culminates in the establishment of a democratic law court, the Areopagus,
No.
lay positions legal justice, arrived at through argument and voting, as the civilized solution, the way to end the primitive cycles of revenge and blood feuds.
It presents the law court as the absolute pinnacle of Athenian political and moral achievement. The mechanism designed specifically to tame the mob, to channel conflict constructively.
Yet the brutal reality of the Arginusae trial showed that this very system could be completely subverted by the mob it was supposed to control. The ultimate source of justice, the sovereign citizen assembly, became, in that instance, the source of arbitrary tyranny.
It's a stark lesson. It proved that a democracy, no matter how sophisticated or highly evolved on paper, is only as strong as its commitment to its own procedural safeguards, especially those designed to protect individuals from collective passion, like the right to an individual trial. When that goes, anything can happen.
But amidst all this chaos, this breakdown of law and reason, there was one dissenting voice, a crucial one, Socrates. He happened to be serving on the presiding council, the Prytany, on that specific fateful day.
Yes, Socrates' opposition is, without doubt, one of the most significant acts of individual political courage in Athenian, maybe even Western history. It's recorded by both Plato and Xenophon.
He was actually the epistates for that day, wasn't he, the sort of chairman?
He was. The epistates was the presiding officer, chosen by lot for just one day, and technically had control over the assembly's agenda and the voting process for those 24 hours. The sources, particularly Xenophon's Hellenica, state clearly that Socrates alone refused to put the illegal motion, the one proposing the collective trial of all 8 generals, to a vote.
He just refused.
He refused, declaring it unconstitutional, illegal under Athenian law, which required individual trials.
Okay, let's just try and visualize that moment. You have the assembly, thousands of citizens whipped into a frenzy, grieving, furious.
Baying for blood, as you said earlier.
And Socrates, as the presiding officer, stands up and says, no, this is illegal. We're not voting on this. The sources say the crowd actually threatened him, didn't they? Threatened to lump him in with generals and try him too.
Yes, the pressure was immense. They shouted him down, threatened him with prosecution, even death, right there on the floor of the assembly. So why did he stick to his principles when his own life was very clearly on the line?
What was driving him? It wasn't just stubbornness, presumably.
No, it runs much deeper. His refusal was fundamentally rooted in his entire philosophy, particularly his ideas about inner law and self-mastery. Socrates believed quite strongly that failing to master your own appetites, whether for physical pleasure or for wealth, or crucially here for external approval and popularity, makes you essentially a slave.
A slave to public opinion.
A slave to public opinion, a hostage to fortune, spiritually enslaved. To give in to the mob's illegal demands, to buckle under their threats just to save his own skin or gain their temporary approval, that would have been a profound philosophical failure for him. It would have been a betrayal of his own core principle of self-mastery.
So his adherence to the law wasn't just about interpreting a statute correctly. It was an expression of his own personal integrity, his inner freedom.
Exactly that. His refusal to endorse the illegal procedure, even facing death threats from this enraged crowd, was the supreme act of political self-mastery. He adhered to the law because he believed it represented a higher, more stable principle, a kind of truth, not because it was politically expedient or popular at that moment.
It reminds me of how Xenophon described him. Didn't Xenophon say Socrates tried to be beneficial in every situation?
He did. Xenophon portrayed Socrates as someone who always sought to live boldly against conventional pressures and social norms, and whose goal was always to be beneficial, both to himself by cultivating his soul, and to the city. For Socrates, in that critical moment, upholding the constitutional law, even against the overwhelming tide of popular opinion, was the most beneficial action possible for Athens in the long run, even if they couldn't see it then.
And this stance, this commitment to principle over passion, it creates such a stark contrast, doesn't it? Between the philosopher's search for stable truth and the immediate emotional passion-driven verdict the assembly was demanding.
A huge contrast. The assembly was operating entirely on transient beliefs, fueled by raw emotion. Plato, in dialogues like the Menominee, talks about how true opinions or beliefs are kind of fleeting, unstable, liable to fly away unless they're tethered by reason, by knowledge of why they are true. Aetius Lygismos.
So the assembly believed they were right, out of grief and rage.
They absolutely believed it in the moment. But it was an untethered belief driven by passion, not grounded in law or reason.
Whereas Socrates was demanding something more permanent, grounded knowledge.
Precisely. The whole Socratic philosophical enterprise, as Plato portrays it, was concerned with defining the stable, unchanging nature of things. Think of the Euthyphro dialogue, where he relentlessly pushes Euthyphro to define what holiness truly is, not just give examples.
Right. He wanted the essence, the principle.
Yes. And the implication for the trial is clear. Socrates believed that legality, true justice, must be grounded in an immutable principle in this case, the established constitutional framework requiring individual trials, not in the fleeting approval or the furious disapproval of the crowd in that particular moment. The assembly's verdict was transient, emotional, politically motivated. It lacked that grounding.
So in Socrates' eyes, the assembly's action, regardless of the majority vote, couldn't be considered genuinely just because it violated that fundamental legal principle. They were acting purely on passion, not law.
That seems to be the core of his objection. He saw the assembly, driven by rage and manipulated by demagogues, acting in direct opposition to a principled fidelity to constitutional law. His ultimate concern wasn't just the fate of the 8 generals, but the lasting integrity of the city's legal structure.
He saw the bigger danger.
He knew that if the democracy could break its own fundamental laws to execute 8 men today simply because the crowd demanded it, then there were effectively no reliable legal protections left for anyone tomorrow, including himself, as it turned out.
So he defended the law itself, even though it meant risking his own life. And that action becomes a crucial, almost prophetic precursor to his own trial and execution years later, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. His own trial, ironically, was carried out by the same volatile Athenian court system, susceptible to prejudice, rhetoric, and political manipulation that he had tried to hold to its own standards during the Arginusae crisis.
It almost seems like his death confirmed his deepest fears about the system.
In many ways, yes. It confirmed his belief that the emotional, decentralized, and rhetorically charged nature of the Athenian courts made them fundamentally incapable of consistently upholding legal standards, especially when faced with strong political pressure or popular prejudice. The city was willing to kill its victorious generals and, later, its most famous philosopher, all in the name of satisfying the immediate perceived will of the people.
What a truly profound and frankly disturbing lesson this deep dive offers us about democracy and law.
It really is. The trial of the generals stands as definitive, chilling proof that even a highly evolved democracy, one with written laws, complex institutions, unprecedented citizen participation, it's fundamentally not immune to committing judicial murder.
When fear or rage takes over.
Exactly. When the public's desire for vengeance or simply for a scapegoat, combined with political expediency, outweighs its fidelity to its own established legal processes, the majority can instantly become a tyrant.
And the sources do confirm, don't they, that the Athenians later regretted this. They realized their grave error.
They did. Fairly soon after the mood shifted, they turned on and prosecuted the very demagogues, including Theramenes, who had incited the illegal trial, and whipped up the frenzy. Some were executed themselves.
So there was some accountability, eventually, but that doesn't change the core lesson, does it?
Not at all. If anything, it reinforces it. The core lesson remains. Legal protection for the individual, particularly fundamental procedural rights, like the right to an individual hearing, the requirement for direct personal liability. These aren't just technicalities. They are the essential check against the potential tyranny of the majority.
It's the firewall.
It is the firewall. It's the procedural rule that marks the crucial difference between a society genuinely ruled by constitutional law and one ruled by the unpredictable waves of political passion and popular opinion. Arginusae remains this chilling cautionary tale about the inherent fragility of any self-governing system when it's pushed to its limits by crisis, grief, and fear.
And that brings us to our final provocative thought for you, our listeners, to consider as you reflect on this really dark chapter of Athenian democracy. The sources suggest that the Athenian assembly, even after realizing its massive constitutional error demonstrated by prosecuting the demagogues who caused it, was nevertheless somehow incapable of formally admitting its own constitutional fault directly. It punished the manipulators, but didn't seem to formally acknowledge the illegality of the collective trial itself in a lasting way. So here's the question. Given that the Athenian court system was structurally designed the way it's relying so heavily on impassioned rhetoric, appeals to collective honor, channeling public conflict into this high-stakes, almost theatrical feud, how much did the very structure of their democratic justice system make it inherently difficult, maybe even impossible, for Athens as a collective entity to ever truly acknowledge and correct a national constitutional mistake like this? If justice is always in part a public spectacle designed to manage conflict, can it ever truly admit a fundamental flaw in its own script? Something to mull over.